If stories are how we see the past and our eyes are how we see the present, how might we be able to see the future? Just like darkness, which creates the illusion of uncertainty, we fear the future because we are blind to it. So if that's the case, who would you choose to guide you into a better tomorrow? Throughout the story, we see many characters devote themselves to a leader that gives them no guarantees besides the stories that were told about them and their appearance right in front of them. Sometimes we see characters trust in an illusionary leader like Mr. Zero in Alabasta, or even Kuma and Bonnie's belief in Nika is an example of that. But other times we see characters like Zoro who saw firsthand what a captain like Luffy would be capable of. But it's a different case when you follow someone in hopes to bring about a specific kind of future, when you have a vision or desire out of that future. For the Navy, it's just justice, and some are disheartened to see the reality of it. For pirates, there are never any guarantees, but for a group like the revolutionaries, there is a goal, an almost defined line for that goal, and we see characters of so many dispositions come together and bet their future on a single man. And so today we are going to talk about the interesting possibility that Dragon might not have all the same facilities as everyone else. It's likely that Oda is setting up Dragon to become a character that has seen through all the darkness and chaos in the One Piece world, unlike anybody else. Where one sees an angry mob, another sees beyond that to the true emotions of the crowd that contrast the visual truth, like what Fuji Tor did in Dressrosa, or something like how when the Straw Hats see an enemy, Luffy sees an ally. A lot of the times, if we only relied on our eyes to move forward into the future, we'd find ourselves still stuck in the past. When Zoro sensed the breath of all things, it was with his eyes closed. He heard it. When Luffy first accessed Future Sight, it was with his eyes closed. Arguably, one of the most aware characters in the story is a blind man, and several times Oda has even shown us a closed eye motif. And ultimately, what this video will be about is the idea that Dragon might be navigating the Revolutionary Army completely blind. Yeah, that might have blindsided you, so let me connect you to the vision. The way I view the world is by making connections. So let me connect you to my vision, the Parvision. I've pitched this theory before on stream, but I let it sit with me and I started seeing how much more depth there is to this idea. But let's start with where I started. It was the idea that Dragon was illiterate as a joke because I misremembered a scene where Dragon asked a subordinate to read a newspaper about Luffy. But then when I went back, it was actually weirder than that. So if we rewind to chapter 440, this is placed right after Luffy saves Robin and is attributed with declaring war on the world government at Enies Lobby. And he was given a new bounty along with more notoriety around the world, and one of the reactions is from the Revolutionary Army. So if we walk through the panels, we see a Revolutionary Army soldier announce, "Our insurgents in Centauria of South Blue have won." Someone else adds, "Another nation has fallen. We did it. The other day we won in the North Blue." And Dragon interrupts saying, "Do not rejoice over victories. This is war." And then he turns towards a desk and places his hand on a piece of paper and says, "What is this?" Then the station soldier says, "It's Straw Hat Luffy. He was the one who defeated Crocodile in Alabasta, and he caused a separate incident at Enies Lobby. They've grown into a major gang of pirates that the world government cannot ignore," then states their total bounty and was about to add that Garp is Luffy's grandfather. But before he could finish, Dragon leaves. But did you catch the weird part? This scene in hindsight is so weird because Dragon places his hand on a wanted poster of his son and asks, "What is this?" And then the soldier explains the news that was going around the entire world that all the soldiers were reading about. And so the context leaves it be that Dragon is looking at probably the most recognizable piece of paper that even children in the One Piece world could decipher to be a wanted poster. So why is he asking, "What is this?" And it becomes even weirder because it's a picture of his son. Now we know that Dragon left Luffy to be raised by Garp, but we know that Dragon visited Luffy twice in his childhood, but more importantly at Logtown 2 not too long ago. At this point, it was about a month later. But would Dragon really forget the image of his own son? So not only is he staring at a picture of his son and a wanted poster, two things that should be easily recognizable not to just Dragon but most of the world. Even a kid could see that it's a wanted poster and could read the name Monkey D. Luffy, which in Dragon's case is his own last name. And so you rub two brain cells together and Dragon should be able to figure out that, hey, that's my last name and middle initial and the name I gave my child. So asking what is this is kind of nonsensical given that nuance. On top of that, if Dragon was able to read, everything that guy said is common information found on the newspaper. And it's not like any of that info is on the wanted poster either. And keep in mind, at this time, Dragon doesn't want anyone to know he is related to anybody. So why even ask or show interest? He literally told Kuma to just kill him for even alluding to the idea, which would expose his biggest weakness. So then you start to wonder, well, if he were just illiterate like I thought in my initial joke, then at least Luffy's picture would be recognizable, and people who grow into adulthood with illiteracy adapt to things that they can learn without reading, like the format of a wanted poster. So with these details, it would have to be more like that Dragon is legally blind or lost his vision or was always permanently blinded. And I know that this conclusion is kind of a big jump, but bear with me because there's more to it. So obviously I wouldn't be able to go on in the theory without bringing the obvious character that serves as a point of relativity to Dragon if he were visually impaired, that I already connected to without this assertion in my previous Dragon video. But yes, Fuji Tor. There is significance Oda has given to a character like Fuji Tor who cannot see with his eyes, but though he cannot see, it would be inaccurate to say Fuji Tor doesn't have vision. In fact, I would argue that Fuji Tor can see better than most of the One Piece world, and that seems to be due to his elevated observation haki. And naturally it would make sense that we might see other characters who see the same way Fuji Tor does. I mean, there's not many characters that seem to have personally ticked off Akainu like Fuji Tor and even Dragon. Fuji Tor is so headstrong that he was pseudo-exiled for standing by his vision for justice that Akainu just couldn't see. And ironically, based on how Akainu refers to Dragon, it does seem like there could be a personal relationship that alludes to how Dragon directly opposed Akainu's ideals as well. I mean, we did get the line saying that Dragon operated in the Navy and left because he found nothing that could be called justice. And it's pretty likely that was a direct reference to a marine like Akainu. In a lot of ways, I look at Fuji Tor being the most revolutionary kind of Navy admiral. He is countlessly opposing direct orders, not caring for what image he has to uphold because, well, he can't even see it anyways. All he can feel is the injustice. If Fuji Tor were to leave the Navy and start the Revolutionary Army, I could easily see Akainu referring to Fuji Tor in a similar scornful way, like it feels like he has for Dragon, which might be the exact parallel, that Dragon was the Fuji Tor to Akainu pre-admiral rank. But that loose connection isn't why I think Dragon is like Fuji Tor. It's because of two reasons. First, emotional sense. Fuji Tor and Dressrosa demonstrated what we would consider one of the greatest forms of emotional sense, in that he could sense the true emotions of the mob that was running to shield Luffy. He could literally see the colors of an individual via what we understand to be observational haki. Now the thing is, we know that Luffy has this power as well. I mean, he literally used it on Fuji Tor earlier in this fight by ascertaining that Fuji Tor wasn't a bad guy and that the fight wasn't all that serious despite each side having a lot that they were staking on the confrontation. But the point comes later on when Luffy recalls Rayleigh's word regarding future sight. It was that Luffy seems exceptionally attuned to the emotions of others and that the power was unconscious. And this was nearly exactly how Luffy's Conqueror's Haki was described at Marineford. When Luffy unlocked it, Ivankov said it was still an unconscious power and added that it makes sense because the apple wouldn't have fallen too far from the tree, in a direct reference to Dragon being that tree. And so if Conqueror's Haki is something we can assume Dragon to have based on that interaction, it might make sense that Dragon is similarly attuned to the emotions of others. And taking into consideration that since Luffy's unconscious Conqueror's Haki power is bloomed to the point that it's basically his most powerful asset, I wouldn't be surprised if emotional sense can bloom into an equally powerful tool or ability. And we know that as a basis for power, it is incredibly effective. As from another angle, we saw a Haki bloom born straight out of emotional sense from Kobe. When Kobe awakened his Haki, it was in the form of something similar to Voice of All Things, except it was declared to be canonically observational Haki. But specifically, Kobe could sense the emotions of people dying and losing their families, and was overcome with sadness. And though this power doesn't fill you with the overarching feeling of strength and power, the realization is that my long-standing belief that Kobe would debut an attack coupled with Conqueror's Haki that would blow everyone's mind came true. This Kobe that was burdened by this ability jettisoned into the position where Garp could rely on him to be a hero that saved the rest of his subordinates instead of him having to do it himself. I'm sure those last two sentences were things that various groups might have an issue with, but I'll explain each in different videos. Instead, here I want to refocus on the part that in order for Kobe to get to that point, he had to train, and it was none other than Bogart and Garp that were his mentors. But specifically, the medic reassured Kobe that his teacher Garp would be able to help him transition his power to a useful ability. Because remember, at the time, Kobe was saying just by awakening this power, he could feel the presence of everyone around him so strongly it was unnerving. And the thing is, right now in the story, Kobe is the child that Garp had always wanted. He wanted Ace and Luffy and even Sabo probably to become Marines. He also mentored a former admiral in Kuzan that ultimately defected to the world of pirates. But the thing that stung him first was his actual son turning coat and becoming a revolutionary. And what I think is the case with Dragon is that Dragon endured all of the training that we have seen from Garp. The way he raised Ace and Luffy was probably how he raised Dragon, except Garp was in his prime then. The battleship bags and all the lessons that Kuzan had, Dragon probably also endured. I mean, we do know that Garp the Fist must have trained Dragon in martial arts relating to fists. The reason I say that is because Sabo uses a technique called Dragon Claw Fist, which is the funniest name because it's a clawed palm strike, but for some reason the name forces the word fist into it. And since Sabo most likely learned this from Dragon, as we have covered many times at this point, then the first part most likely is Dragon's tribute to Garp being the one who mentored him. And to touch back on the current star pupil, Kobe, if Garp is equipped enough to teach Kobe, who has a basis in emotional sensing, to become the monster he is now, then I would imagine that Garp had experience with this due to his first student, who is most likely Dragon. I think Oda used all of Garp's proteges to lightly introduce everything that Dragon had experienced, and again, we will focus on all the other avenues in separate videos. The one I'm focusing on right now is emotional sense, because it gives us a fuller picture of how Dragon might operate if he has what Kobe showed us plus what Fuji Tor showed us, and there's actually two more extrapolations we can make later on in this video, but just these two are enough to help support a blinded Dragon to operate in the world, as we see Fuji Tor operating with relative ease given he is an admiral and is basically unperturbed by it. But Fuji Tor actually shows us something interesting, because even with his coping mechanisms for blindness that allows him to match Luffy and Zoro in combat, he admits that he has no idea what Luffy looks like. To him, Luffy is just a figure of kindness, just a blob that made him laugh and is honest to a fault, but one that a whole country of colorful blobs were running to save. And the thing is, if Dragon were blind, then it could make sense that's why he couldn't recognize his own son on the wanted poster. But that's not the only reason why I think Dragon has a health condition of the sort. The second time was actually retconned by the anime, but if we were to stick to the word of Oda, then this scene almost makes no sense unless Dragon were blind. So the example is actually in Grey Terminal. Just before the tragic Holocaust finished, Sabo in chapter 586 was running all around the town trying to notify the citizens about the oncoming genocide, looking to try and prevent the innocent lives from dying, and ended up realizing that the nobles and aristocrats were fully aware and complicit and in agreement with the king's action to purge the less fortunate citizens. This led Sabo to the wall to take matters into his own hands, where he was confronted with the royal guards, and after that skirmish he was blown back in front of Dragon. Dragon asks Sabo, "What's wrong, young man?" And Sabo says, "Mister, the ones responsible for this fire are the royal family and the aristocrats. It's true, this town stinks worse than Trash Mountain. It's filled with the stink of rotten people. If I stay here, I'll never be free. I'm ashamed I was born an aristocrat." And during this, Sabo looks straight into Dragon's face, and Dragon is holding the young man in his arms and is shook by the boy's revelation, thinking about how Goa Kingdom caused this boy to despise his own kind. And despite Dragon's usual anonymity and normally mysterious demeanor, he divulges to Sabo saying, "I understand I was born in this country too, but I still don't have the power to change it." While staying right at each other, in each other's arms, Sabo says, "What I said matters to you?" And Dragon responds, "Of course it does. I'll never forget it." Just remember that, because we know that roughly 2 days later, the Celestial Dragons come to do their inspection, and that's when Sabo sets sail with the appearance of a pirate flag and the intentions to flee his fear of being swallowed up by his toxic nation and turn into someone he'd hate. He was then shot down by the world government in a manner that made us think he was dead, but we know that in chapter 794, Sabo's flashback shows us that he was hit and drowning, asking for help, and somehow Dragon managed to pick Sabo out of the water from just his hand. It seems like Dragon then returned to his ship, which we aren't too sure where this part occurred, but he gets medical assistance for the boy he picked up, and when that boy recovers, they are relieved that he is alive and well, but they realize he has amnesia so bad that he doesn't even remember his own name. And let me read this word for word now. The doctor says yes, he doesn't even remember his own name, and another soldier says, "It says Sabo on your belongings, is that your name?" And the boy says, "Sabo? No idea." And then Dragon says, "Well, it's clear that he's of Goa Kingdom's noble stock." And then someone suggests, "Let's look for his parents and send him back home." To which Sabo is the one who somehow remembers at least his instincts that he does not want to go back. And it seems like they complied. But did you catch that? There's something weird in that dialogue that makes no sense. See, let's start it from Sabo's angle. Sabo was saved, pleading to be taken away and in the hand of strangers. Oh wait, They're not all complete strangers, right? If Sabo did not lose his memories, he would have surely recognized Dragon from 2 days ago and pointed him out saying, "Hey, mister, I bumped into you just before and you said you'd never forget what I said. You believed me." Something along those lines, but obviously Sabo had amnesia. So to the revolutionaries, he was just a boy with no name and belongings that depicted him to be a noble from Goa Kingdom. But that's the weird part, because it should be a two-way street. Dragon said he'd never forget that interaction, but while he was right in front of him, he had no mention to anyone in the Revs that he was the one noble kid trying to expose Goa Kingdom, just like Dragon is trying to do. But not only did Dragon not identify Sabo, he even got the assumption incorrect. He said it's clear that he is from the noble stock, but Sabo personally told Dragon that he wasn't a noble and that he was instead an aristocrat, and they were face to face in that conversation just 2 days prior to this interaction, and Dragon specifically said he would never forget it. And yet he couldn't immediately recognize the boy that shook him to his core, the boy that was fighting against the oppressors, against his own creed, just like he did himself and is trying to do around the world, and probably inspired part of his speech to the refugees of Great Terminal. But it might not be that he forgot. It's just that he didn't see Sabo's face despite Sabo being in his arms. If Dragon were blind, then just like how Fuji Tor has no clue what Luffy looked like, Dragon would have no clue what Sabo looked like and wouldn't be able to recognize him based off of appearance. And then you'd say, but Par, you also said Dragon had insane emotional sense like Fuji Tor and Kobe, so how come he wouldn't be able to feel the same presence? But that's the masterclass part of all of this. Sabo forgot who he was down to his name. That speech that Sabo gave about Goa Kingdom was all gone. The person at the core was still the same. The desire to leave his family was there, but everything else was gone. And so if Dragon had to figure out who Sabo was based off of disposition, but the person's entire life experience was forgotten, then that would make it difficult for him to figure out that this was the same kid. I mean, it wouldn't be normal to assume this random 10-year-old that stumbled into him during a Holocaust was the same 10-year-old who got amnesia 2 days later drowning in the ocean, especially if the other person didn't mention it at all. And that's where it works both ways, because if Dragon were blind and as a person with a disability relying on context clues to cope, in this instance, then Sabo would have recognized Dragon, and then Dragon would have of course immediately be able to connect the dots, which is why we get this scene where the only way it would make sense that neither of them would recognize each other is if they were both encumbered by some sort of disability, like memory loss or blindness. And coupling this moment with chapter 440's bounty poster scene where he needs to ask what that paper was, it makes sense that he is most likely blind. And other scenes start to make sense too, like in chapter 1102 when Dragon wants to go see Luffy in secret, and at this time Sabo has no memories and Dragon's relationship to Luffy is a secret. Sabo asks why Dragon wants to go there, and Dragon says, well, who oversees that area? And that's the thing. Why have that awkward interaction where he has to ask? Surely his vast intelligence network has it written down somewhere. He could have avoided anyone catching on to his relationship to Luffy by just checking the papers himself. And keep in mind that he literally told Kuma that it would be his death if someone were to find out this connection. And even the dialogue Dragon gives of the hesitancy is interesting, which he could have again avoided if he just found the records and checked himself. But that's what's super interesting. I went through every scene with Dragon, and I know it sounds weird, but he has never actually showed that he could read before. And the reason it's significant is because in most times that Dragon is shown in the story, it's within the context of the bounty update chapters, where we jump from island to island seeing everybody reading the news. For Dragon, someone always reads the news to him, or it's being announced, or it's assumed what the news is, and Dragon just waits. Even in chapter 593, Dragon is asked specifically by Ivankov, "Did you see the paper today? Straw Hat Boy never ceases to amaze me, doing such crazy things. The apple didn't fall far from the tree," to which Dragon literally just ignores. Dragon hits Ivankov with a double ellipses and just avoids that question of, "Did you see the paper today?" And so Ivankov had to move on. Looking at the scene in hindsight, it really seemed like Oda wanted to emphasize this moment. The way Dragon answered it, it would only make sense if he actually didn't know because he couldn't see the picture. It almost seems like Dragon was trying to pass through with contextual information he had and wasn't aware of the news he would have had to read to find out. Everything he brought up thereafter was already global news that he would have heard about. But Luffy's 16 bell ring would have been something he would have to read that day. Something small, but It's again kind of similar to Fuji Tor in chapter 957, where Fuji Tor was a part of the news, so as far as being knowledgeable of world events, it wasn't noticeable if he wasn't privy to that information. But we see that despite being such an active player on the board, he is completely unaware of the worldwide published information that Big Mom and Kaido were forming an alliance. This is something we saw many people reacting to, but Fuji Tor was unaware, and most likely it's because he can't read the newspaper, so he needs someone to announce it to him, which in this case, it's a Kainu. If you wanted to see the depiction of what a blind person might look like reading the newspaper, look no further than chapter 818, where Sabo and Koala are flipping through wanted posters, and you see Dragon as the odd man out. He looks very confused and trying to be attentive, almost as if he's acting like he's paying attention. Sabo and Koala are clearly smiling, and it would make sense if it was about Robin and Luffy, but yet Dragon just looks like he has no idea what's going on. And there's one other time where Oda directly makes Dragon look like he is reading, but when we look more closely at the panels in chapter 803, we see Dragon holding what's very clearly not the newspaper. Instead, what we see is that the other revolutionary armies are announcing the news again, and speaking directly to Dragon, telling him that all around the world, Dragon, rebel forces are emerging victorious. To which Dragon says, the fall of the Don Quixote family had wide-reaching effects. Just look at how many nations were involved in weapon smuggling, no wonder things have changed now, and then proceeds to give warnings and premonitions. But that's what would be synthesized from reading the newspaper, no? But he isn't holding a newspaper. We know this is very clearly distinct from what a newspaper looks like. I mean, Oda even drew a graph on this page. So I'm not even sure what Dragon is reading, but it's most certainly not related to anything he is saying or the news at hand. And again, every time Oda has shown Dragon where everyone around the world is reading the news about the bounties or reverie, it's the main characters reading it, and then Dragon is just doing something else. So Oda even breaks the pattern of showing everyone receive the news in a standard way and reacting, even with characters like Shanks, but not with Dragon. And it's even more apparent when you look again at Sabo ear to ear smiling while reading the newspaper, juxtaposed to Dragon just continuing on without acknowledging the news at all. Keep in mind, this is a Dragon post the world knowing that Luffy is his son, so it's not like he even needs to hide his reaction to news about Luffy or his son. Remember the first time he got news about his son? My man needed a break, left without a word, looked east, and started speaking into the winds to his son. I'd imagine he'd be pretty proud to react to these newspapers if he could. I'm sure he ends up hearing about the news of Luffy eventually. It's just interesting because instead we typically see him reacting to the geopolitical reaction from Luffy's fight, so he doesn't get to hear Luffy's name in that regard. But anyways, at this point, I was pretty convinced that Dragon at minimum has lost his eyesight. It might be something that happened to him during his life. I doubt it was a choice like Fuji Tora's case, or maybe it was a sacrifice under duress like Kuma's situation. But it does seem like it's some kind of secret. I don't even think many people in his organization are that aware of it. It could be something that he kept hidden for some reason. And when I pitched this idea a few times to creators and my watch party viewers, they pointed out that unlike Fujitora, who doesn't have pupils, in most fictional tropes depicting blind people, Dragon has eyes. And they seem to even function normally in that Oda depicts them looking at people. But a lot of people forget that there's varied levels to blindness and changes when you weren't born blind. There's a lot of cases where blind people can appear to be maintaining eye contact despite not even being able to see you. That being said, my wife, Mrs. Vision, who studied fine arts, pointed out something interesting, in that she noticed in basically every appearance Dragon has, even when it doesn't make sense to shade his eyes with these lines, Oda has at least one time shaded them like this in every appearance. Keep in mind, yes, Oda does this when someone is serious or in a dark tone, but with Dragon, it's irrelevant to the tone or environment. In fact, it's almost 50% of the time. I'll put all of the instances up on the screen. And so my wife was basically saying if Oda wanted to create the plot twist that he was blind, it could make sense to not follow the trope, but still depict it in this way, as in the light isn't reaching his eyes. And it is another way to depict a blindness in a subtle way. And I kind of agree because a lot of these times are super random. But then even when in the cover story, Oda just blacked out Dragon's eyes, and it might be symbolizing the light not going into his eyes, and that's why he is shown to be so confused. And by this point, I can't really add more details as to why I think he could be blind, because Oda has kept us in the dark about Dragon. If he is, then I think Oda did a fantastic job at hiding it, and if he isn't, then those two scenes are very weird to say the least. Ultimately though, if he were to be blind, I think it would fit his elusive and illusionary role really well. Reading back all of his dialogue and interactions now really makes certain words stand out differently, but especially this part where Dragon's meme about looking east begins. In this scene where Ivankov Ivankov finds Dragon out on the balcony on Beltigo, he says, "You always look out the same way." And Dragon said, "Huh, I never noticed that." And so if he were to be blind, yeah, that would make sense that he wouldn't notice he was in the exact same spot and position every time. But instead, like Ivankov was saying, he has some kind of homing instinct or heightened sense of direction. And Dragon is just facing whatever way feels right to him, not aware that he has looked the same way enough that Ivankov was able to deduce some kind of familial connection in the East Blue. But this also is another way to look at how Dragon sees the world versus how everyone else sees it. Dragon is looking at a direction for reasons no one else can see. Where Ivankov sees a balcony and a sunset and the eastern direction, Dragon sees family. Similarly, where Akainu and Garp see an imperfect system upholding justice, Dragon sees nothing of the sort. Where Smoker and Garp see a pirate, Dragon sees a path of freedom and adventure that will lead Luffy to find his own answers. Dragon seems to be looking at the world through a completely different lens than the rest of the world. And it's interesting because when Luffy tapped into Future Sight the first time, it was when he closed his eyes and calmed down. So maybe closing your eyes to the present and ignoring things like the news and headlines that are full of nonsense a lot of the times could allow a character like Dragon to focus on the true goal at hand, which was the future liberation of millions worldwide. Remember from the previous video, even if Dragon were to be blind, we have a benchmark in Fuji Tor who can see the clouds without his sight. When Luffy goes blind, he sees the future. Apparently Zoro had a time skip and lost an eye and got stronger. There seems to be something Oda is doing with lost vision and power and notoriety. Maybe there's some power gained from purposeful sacrifice that we'll learn of later. Or maybe it'll be some kind of tragedy that resulted in Dragon's unfortunate vision impairment. It makes sense to think that Dragon relies on winds of fate to guide him and his journey, but also explains how though we know Dragon has visited Luffy many times, and he even told Garp he saw Luffy off at Logtown, that he probably didn't get a close look, and Luffy couldn't even see his face either. Remember, the first time Luffy sees his face is in chapter 824, so if Luffy couldn't see his face and Dragon didn't see it either, then Dragon being blind could explain why it wouldn't matter for him to see Luffy visually. Simply seeing his presence was enough. Feeling what kind of man his son turned out to be, and further explaining why if Dragon wouldn't be able to recognize his own son's wanted poster in chapter 440, despite us knowing that he had watched Luffy essentially start his grand voyage, the one we have been following. So if you have followed my vision all the way up to here, then I hope you enjoyed this video. If you haven't already liked and shared this video, I would appreciate that, but ultimately subscribe because I'm continuing to unwrap the mystery Oda has shrouded around Monkey D. Dragon. If you want to know why Dragon has been locked and isolated on Baltigo for most of the story, check out this first video. And very soon, I'll explain why there's nearly a 0% chance that Dragon is a Logia. And there's still 2 more Dragon-centric videos coming, one that will cover his backstory and one that will cover his ultimate power. So thank you for sharing your time and tuning into my vision. And so, like always, thank you for connecting with me, and I'm looking forward to connecting with you all on the next Parvision.